Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Jason Anderson. I do work for Stillaguamish Tribe Natural Resources Department, located in Western Washington. And I've got a series of slides today to share with you. I'm going to be speaking about the topic of invasive plant control and how it can support salmon recovery. So without further ado, let's get going. So a brief overview, very brief, salmon recovery, focusing on Puget Sound, Chinook, and Steelhead, has been ongoing. Plan was initially adopted in 2005, and then there was a supplementation to that plan in 2007. And it must be stressed that salmon recovery is a collaboration between many entities. I've listed a few examples here. Not only are we working at tribal levels, working with federal, state, and many local partners, but there's a lot of organizations involved in salmon recovery up and down the West Coast, as well as Puget Sound. Specifically, within the Stillaguamish River Basin, the Stillaguamish Watershed Council is active, and it provides a forum for stakeholders to come together to address issues, discuss issues, and take action on all those things that stress natural resources in the Stillaguamish Valley. And one of the main focuses of the Stillaguamish Watershed Council is they work to implement the Stillaguamish Chinook Salmon Recovery Plan. And the tribe, the Stillaguamish tribe, is an active participant in the Watershed Council. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Stillaguamish River Basin, here's a map showing its location. Again, we're in Western Washington. The watershed boundaries primarily are in Snohomish County, as well as in the north portion of the watershed boundary extends into Skagit counties in Washington state. The river does flow generally east to west, and the mouth of the river flows into Port Susan over near Camano Island. So speaking in a little bit more detail about the recovery plan itself in the Stillaguamish Basin, it has a stated goal of essentially working to recover Chinook salmon populations to sustainable and harvestable levels. And unfortunately, currently, the Chinook salmon populations in the Stillaguamish are estimated to be less than 10% of historic levels. And the recovery plan addresses a series of strategies. Not only is there a harvest strategy, there is a hatchery strategy. I'm going to be focusing a lot on the habitat strategy today and the nexus between habitat and the Stillaguamish and its relationship to invasive plant control. So just know that there are many strategies in the recovery plan, but essentially habitat recovery, the goal is to try to maintain and restore natural ecosystem conditions that will then in turn contribute to increasing salmonid productivity. So as it pertains to the habitat strategy and the recovery plan, it does require us to have an understanding of not only land use practices in the basin, but then also watershed scale processes and current habitat conditions as they pertain to Chinook salmon requirements. And then also necessary elements, we need to consider not only the restoration, but also protection of habitat. And when I'm referring to habitat, I mean, this pertains not only to, say, freshwater habitat, but then also estuarine habitat, floodplain habitat, in-stream habitat. And so it's not just focusing on any one of those categories. It does encompass all those different ecosystem types. So in addition to the habitat strategy outlined in the Chinook recovery plan, the Stillaguamish Watershed Council has also adopted an acquisition strategy. And this was first created in 2015, and then it was updated in 2020. And this acquisition strategy essentially describes an overarching goal of establishing a corridor of protected lands along the Stillaguamish, as well as some major tributaries that are associated with Chinook salmon use. And within this protected corridor, the concept is to allow enough space and for which riverine processes are allowed to function and occur unimpeded in a more natural way. And this was first envisioned based on the fact that in order to try to improve habitat conditions dramatically enough to support Chinook, it was realized that you needed to do some pretty bold and pretty large scale projects. And it was a challenge to find enough willing landowners to allow those projects to occur. So many of the stakeholders in the basin are now actively working together to try to acquire some of these large floodplain parcels and estuarine parcels in order to implement the high priority projects to affect the Chinook salmon habitat. And the tribe has been very active in this effort. So with that being said, the tribe has taken that leadership role in acquiring a lot of these larger parcels and priority parcels in the basin, and they've taken them under tribal ownership. They're located from not only the mouth of the river, moving up through the main stem, Stillaguamish, into some of the two forks, the North Fork and the South Fork. So they're scattered not only from lower in the watershed, but then further up in the watershed. And then recently, there's also some parcels that have been acquired in more upland forested environments as well. And so as a result, we as a department, we kind of saw that we had a need to develop a more cohesive strategy in terms of how we're going to address invasive species in general on these different and various parcels. And so we applied for some invasive species funding from BIA. So thank you to Robert Compton for the help that he provided for us to receive this funding. And our goal with this funding is to write an invasive species management plan. We have a stated goal within the plan. We've been working together. There's a team of biologists here in the department. We're identifying priority species, habitats, pathways of introductions. We're defining our approach, and then we're also going to define and implement practices so that we can address invasive species in, like I said, a more cohesive and efficient way. So kind of hearkening back to what Wendell mentioned in the previous presentation, one of the components of the plan is conducting invasive plant surveys, and we've begun this effort on a series of tribal properties. This is an example from an output map that we created in 2022, showing locations of invasive plants on a piece of property the tribe owns near the mouth of the Stillaguamish River. So this was a survey primarily for Spartina. And we are doing these invasive plant surveys, obviously, so that we can kind of know the geographic location of these plants, but then also we want to get an idea of what's the density of the plants. And then also this helps us to make a plan in terms of what our response will be, how we're going to address these plants, and how much effort we think we're going to need in order to respond when we move into control efforts. So I also want to stress that we're working really hard within the department to build our capacity so that we can coordinate well with neighboring tribes, Tulalip, Skagit Systems River Cooperative, as well as working with state agencies like Washington State Department of Agriculture, and also county agencies like the Snohomish County Noxious Weed Coordinator. So we're working on building that capacity. So for some of us who are listening into the presentation on Tuesday, there was several good descriptions of definitions of invasive species in general. So when it comes to invasive plants, I like to use this terminology, and this is something that we've adopted within our invasive species management plan. Essentially, we're terming invasive plants as those that are not native, in other words, non-indigenous or found outside of their natural range. And then I like the wording containing in Executive Order as I mentioned here in the slide, but the introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to humans, animals, or plant health. I think that's a good definition, but I would add to that, invasive plants also negatively impact tribal foods, medicines, or ceremonial practices. And so I think that's, at least within the context of the invasive species management plan that we're writing, that's an important component to the definition that I'd like to add. So when it comes to invasive plant management goals and objectives, again, we try to be very clear about the intent of what we're attempting to do. And there are terms listed here, and I think it's important to review them because I hear sometimes people state a goal that they want to eradicate a population of plants. It's very widespread, and perhaps better could be stated a little more clearly in the sense that perhaps you want to contain or suppress that population. And so when I hear eradication, I mean, to me, that's a relatively small group, a small number of plants that you do have an opportunity to control it in a way to literally remove that entire population. And I think going back to what Justin said on the invasive species, the curve itself, you're able to detect a plant at a point in time in which you do have a chance of eradicating it. It's a very small number, or it's distributed in a very localized area, so you do stand a chance of eradicating it. However, when you do discover those plants that are spread upon thousands of acres, then that becomes a much more challenging and tough proposition to try to eradicate those plants, as Wendell alluded to. Really, you must start working on those containment or suppression methods in order to get a handle on it.
About 3.5 minutes left, Jason.
Thank you. So again, invasive plant control methods that we utilize here at Stillaguamish are going to be very similar to those methods that other agencies are using, other tribes are using. Again, manual methods using hand tools, mechanical methods, powered tools, or tracked or wheeled tools, as I like to call them, tractors, mowers, things of that nature. We have field crews that are trained in herbicide application. Spot spraying is, again, a very standard practice. Manual control, grubbing, pulling. At Stillaguamish, we're not using any biological control at this point in time, but we do try to use the methods that are available to us in combination to try to maximize our weed control outcomes. So when it comes to invasive plant control, I want to stress that I believe it does complement restoration. Control work often precedes a restoration action because in many cases, restoration of native plant communities is or should be the end goal. And that's what we strive for here. Invasive plant control can often work not only preceding an actual restoration project, but then also it can be a component of weed control to support establishment of native plants. And active restoration, of course, is one thing that we're all quite familiar with when it comes to buying containerized stock or bare root stock, planting that stock, reseeding grasslands. But in some situations, Stillaguamish has used passive restoration, for example, at a tidal marsh property, removing some sea dikes and allowing natural recruitment of grasses and sedges occurred over 75 acres of a property within 2 to 3 years. And so restoring the natural process of seed deposition to this tidal marsh did result in more of a passive restoration technique that worked out well. Of course, we are still surveying, then this was the map I showed earlier, we are still surveying for Spartina and other noxious weeds and working to control them as we're allowing the native grasses and rushes and sedges to recruit at the site.
Just about a minute left.
Thank you. And so In closing, I'd just like to reiterate that invasive plant control is not necessarily the end goal. Rather, invasive plant control coupled with restoration of native plant communities will ultimately improve ecosystem functions, and we hope that those ecosystem functions will contribute to salmon recovery. And that's my last slide. So I'd like to thank everybody for your attention and be happy to continue the conversation during the listening session.